Ever since Batman's disappeared, things have really turned for the worst here in the place you're watching this video from. And I'm sick of it. That's why I won't rest until every criminal is back in our... Sorry, I'm getting over it. I'm getting over a cold. Oh, God. I'm okay. I'm okay.
Back in the 90s, Batman was sort of everywhere, with Tim Burton's Batman movie from 1989 being the absolute juggernaut that it was. Warner Brothers was keen to try and keep this modern wave of Batmania afloat for as long as they could in the form of sequels, accompanying albums with delightfully gimmicky novelty gems like Bat Dance and video games. Lots and lots of video games. But in conjunction with these pieces of movie merchandise, Warner Brothers' animation division also set out to create a brand new animated Batman series that would end up launching DC's iconic late 90s and early 2000s animated universe. The aptly titled Batman the Animated Series debuted in September 1992 and ran for a total of 85 episodes, along with getting 2 feature films, getting renamed The Adventures of Batman and Robin halfway through its run, and it also got a sequel series a few years later that was punctually titled The New Batman Adventures. You know, I think I've heard that somewhere else before. For many of the people watching this, that 90s animated Batman may just be the definitive version of the character. The late and great Kevin Conroy's take on the Caped Crusader is iconic for nailing the gravelly gruffness of Batman while simultaneously managing to merge those qualities with the suave and empathetic Bruce Wayne. That, coupled with the number of times he played the guy either in the DCAU directly or in a number of video games or animated movies from over the years, basically cemented him as being Batman, especially when you consider how the series came out during the dark ages for the character in terms of his popularity due to the critical reception that Joel Schumacher's take on live-action Batman movies were getting at the time.
If you had to draw a king, you'd definitely draw him, although maybe not as well as this, unless you're a 16th century portrait artist.
And because of this, we naturally got a ton of Batman the Animated Series tie-in video games. So many, in fact, that I'm cutting things off at Batman TAS games and not including the ones specifically related to the new Batman Adventures or that came out during that show's run. Between 1993 and 1995, we got no less than 5 games based on the pre-DCAU version of Batman the Animated Series, with the Sega CD, Genesis, Game Gear, and SNES getting releases bearing the Adventures of Batman and Robin moniker, while Nintendo's Game Boy got one explicitly named after the original series' title due to coming out before the name change. While each of these games do ultimately follow the same template of Batman needing to vanquish some of his most iconic rogues with the help of his buddies Law and Order, they're actually all unique games aside from some very superficial similarities between them. The Nintendo games in the bunch were both made and published by Konami, with the Game Boy title coming out in November 1993 to fairly good reviews, and the SNES one coming out around a year later to an equally positive reception. In fact, the lowest score I could find from the era came from the German magazine Video Games, a publication that I always seem to bring up whenever I'm fishing for negative reviews, who gave it a 69 out of 100, but did ultimately say that they enjoyed it. And on the Sega side of things, the Genesis and CD games were handled by Clockwork Tortoise. If you've never heard of them, I don't blame you, because they were formed by some ex-Malibu Interactive staff in 1994, made 3 games, but only managed to release the 2 Batman ones to mixed and somewhat negative reviews back in 1995, and then quietly disbanded in 1996 or 1997. Meanwhile, the Game Gear game was handled by Novatrade International, the guys who were best known for Echo the Dolphin, and also got released in 1995 to mostly mixed reviews. But do they hold up? Because it sounds like a pretty open and shut book, doesn't it? We've got 5 animated Batman games, and based off of reviews from back in the day, it would seem like the only ones that are worth checking out are by Konami. Except for the fact that I think the critics may have been wrong and that there may be more to it than meets the eye. And when I say that they may have been wrong, I don't mean it in the grr, game reviewers never know what they're talking about, insert blanket statement about the death of the critic and some virtue signaling follow-up about how I like to think for myself kind of way either. I just think that 2.5 decades later, and within the context of playing them after these types of games have had time to become nostalgic again, it may be worth checking these games out to see whether or not people should still try and play them. Especially since, over the years, the Sega Genesis game has actually gained something of a cult reputation for being an extremely underrated and impressive late release for the Genesis's library, and in the case of the Sega CD game, it contains what could be considered something of a lost episode of Batman the Animated Series. I also just thought it would be fun to check these games out too, because a week before Kevin Conroy's passing, I actually started rewatching the show for the first time since I was a kid and naturally got curious about the video games. And now that Kevin Conroy is unfortunately gone, some of you guys watching this video may find that these games are a worthy way of memorializing him and the iconic series that he was a part of. Even though I was more of a Superman and Spider-Man kid growing up, I've still always had a deep love for the series and the way that its original art style took inspiration from Max Fleischer's Superman cartoons from back in the 40s, which coincidentally were some of my other favorite cartoons from my childhood too. Plus, I do have fond memories of playing the Genesis game quite a bit with my best friend Mike back in high school, and I even got into the game with my girlfriend over the summer again, so checking out these other licensed games for the series has been a long time coming for me. Also, I don't know if you know this or not, but Batman is still really popular, guys. So if there's even a tiny chance of there being not one, not two, but 5 other fun games to check out alongside the likes of Batman NES and the other great Batman releases from over the years, why shouldn't we take the time to confirm it? So in today's video, I'll be reviving the tier list idea from my RoboCop vs. the Terminator video in order to rank each of these Batman the Animated Series games and find out which ones you might want to check out someday. Before we continue though, a quick question of the day. What was the last game that you got really into? I mean, like, really into. A game you got so invested into that people would mistake you in it for that painting of Saturn devouring his sun. Be sure to leave your answer to the question of the day over in the comments. I'd love to hear your answer. On top of that, feel free to subscribe and share the video with your friends or anywhere you see fit if you're enjoying what you see so far, as it goes a long way in helping the channel grow. You can also subscribe to me on Patreon or do a one-off tip to my Buy Me a Coffee if you want to get some bonus goodies too. And with that out of the way, on with the video. Alright, so right off the bat, man, I thought I'd start with the SNES game by Konami. This one was released in December 1994 and finds Batman doing battle with several of his most iconic enemies and pseudo-recreations of several episodes of the show. Yep, you heard me right. Instead of creating an entirely original story for this game, Konami just elected to recreate a handful of episodes and to stitch them together. Truth be told, I actually love this approach to framing a story though, because not only does it come across as somewhat original in a weirdly counterintuitive sort of way, at least based off my experience, but it kind of feels like fan service at the same time. With a lot of licensed games, especially ones related to a TV series, I feel like they always just elect to go and create wholly new stories that just happens to work in characters you know and love. And while that approach definitely works, there's also just something really novel about recognizing story beats, locations, and even some dialogue that you weren't expecting to have appear in the first place.
It has billions of optic and auditory nerves, 4 lobes and 2 hemispheres, and it's the only thing Edward Nygma respects.
I understood that reference.
It was really pleasant to find myself watching an episode of the show and then coincidentally seeing the game adapted or vice versa and getting to compare the differences between the two of them in the process. Anyway, each of the levels are opened with a title card that feels straight out of the show and starts with the context of Batman being debriefed about what one of his sworn enemies are up to before vowing to stop them and loading up on the necessary gear to do so. I don't know why he swears at enemies specifically to begin with, but hey, I'm also not the vigilante, so whatever. Although, I am technically a vigilante this week. That was supposed to be the gimmick for this video. It's just a shame I'm not particularly vigilant, you know? Moving on, the levels usually take the form of being a 2D side-scroller with some light beat-em-up elements thrown in, with the exception of a single top-down driving level, and revolves around the Cape Crusader needing to accomplish a changing array of objectives needed to clear the stage and get to that episode's boss fight. It sounds simple, and it is, but the game does a great job of never feeling particularly dull due to the contents of each of these levels calling for Batman to employ different skills to get to the end of them. For example, the Joker's stage is a fairly straightforward level that eases you into the controls and gameplay before taking you into a boss battle that's based on the climax to the episode Be a Clown, complete with the gimmick of needing to dodge a seemingly endless supply of dynamite that the Joker's throwing at you.
Some days you just can't get rid of a bomb.
But in the next level, you'll find yourself in a more vertically oriented stage and need to use your grappling gun to swing through a forest while using ranged weapons in order to non-lethally subdue some of Poison Ivy's goons, followed by another stage where you'll need to solve some puzzles, etc., etc. It's a pretty decent spread of ideas that may not feel particularly well developed or deep, but accomplishes the goal of making Batman feel like more than just a person who sounds like he chain smokes and kicks the crap out of bad guys. It brings him closer in line with the character we know and love from the cartoon. This is accentuated by the fact that, unlike a lot of the other Batman games from the era, which had you do the very video gamey action of picking up new items by defeating enemies, you're actually responsible for equipping your utility belt with any of the tools you'll think you'll need before venturing out of the Batcave in this game. It's a small detail, but it's genuinely nice due to how subtle it is, and it's also cool that these gadgets aren't required to get through the game in the first place, but rather offer little quality of life benefits to you should you decide to use them. As if that weren't enough, you can also just pause the game during a level in order to return to the Batcave too, restoring your health and allowing you to swap out your gadgets before going back out and restarting the level.
Perhaps you should read the instructions first.
And yeah, looking at this in universe, it's a bit weird to be a hostage getting rescued by Batman only to have him turn around and tie you back up so that he could go home and grab his smoke grenades or whatever, but in the context of the game itself, it's still really cool. That said, it's also still a bit of a cop-out, because even though I wouldn't necessarily call the adventures of Batman and Robin on the Super Nintendo hard, its levels do feel like they tend to drag a bit and do a bit too good of a job at whittling your health down before what's essentially itself usually a somewhat extended boss fight. It's hardly the end of the world or anything, if anything it's just some old school game design, but it does remind me a bit of how Castlevania games work, which, given the fact that this is by Konami, I guess makes total sense. SNES Batman has a pretty good variety of moves that range from being able to do a wall jump like the one from the Sunsoft Tim Burton game on NES to doing a dodge roll that you'll probably abuse to get around faster and end up looking like an Ocarina of Time speedrunner in the process, and you can even perform a grapple throw alongside the expected punches and kicks and even use your grappling gun.
Hook!
Which I think really encapsulates what this game does best because, like I said earlier, it sends you on a bunch of different missions with different objectives, and in the process, that kind of makes you feel like you're Batman. I think it's fair to suggest that at some point in most of our lives, a lot of us have probably imagined what it would be like to be Batman, to lurk in the shadows, waiting to spring into action and save the innocent from harm's way.
Oh my god, oh my god, oh my god, this is a whole new level of nerd.
You're right, this is ridiculous. What am I doing?
Wait, no, I mean that in a good way, Ben.
Because Batman's inherent humanity as a non-superpowered superhero is a huge part of what endears him to us. He's literally just a man with exorbitant wealth and the resources to research and develop a ton of high-tech toys to beat bad guys up with, but ultimately, and usually, still just a man.
I was a boy! Now I'm a bat!
I'm sorry.
Which is something that the adventures of Batman and Robin showcases front and center. For instance, Batman has to rely on his ingenuity and the tools around him to save the day. He has to solve the Riddler's maze in order to save his friends, just as he has to get a password to open a locked door. Short of Superman replacing him for a little bit and going berserk on any obstacle in his way thanks to his super strength, it's the only way things will ever get done.
Too bad we can't mix and match.
Similarly, throwing a driving level into this game feels appropriate because exciting car chases that take place in the Batmobile is a really Batman thing to have a player do. Which is why it probably feels like Batman's had better luck when it comes to video games than some of his peers, because the character lends himself towards a wider variety of gameplay styles. Because really, would you be that shocked if they made a Batman-themed version of Minesweeper for the Game Boy someday? However, when it comes to the actual execution of its ideas, the Adventures of Batman and Robin on the SNES also leaves a bit to be desired. Even though the movement itself is fine, the combat just feels way too simple for its own good because all you can really do is punch, throw enemies, and use projectiles, which is fine in theory but lacks the necessary heft to feel entirely satisfying. For comparison's sake, when you hit enemies in Sunsoft's Batman NES game, you manage to feel the weight of your punches despite the game lacking rumble. But here, you may as well just be politely nudging them. That doesn't stop the combat from being fun, mind you, but it does mean that things eventually reach a point where they start to get a bit old, especially if you happen to return to the Batcave for any reason and need to restart a level. And while it's definitely nice that you can use tools like batarangs to stun enemies or straight up obliterate, though somehow non-lethally, enemies with explosives, it still does fall a bit flat. Things aren't helped either by the lack of enemy variety in this game too, because even though some of the stages do have unique opponents, Konami also tends to send generic criminals your way in droves for most of the adventure. I guess Gotham was having a Zoot Suit riot? You know, like the song, Zoot Suit Riot. Still, there's a lot to like here, such as the boss battles. Whenever you confront a boss in a one-on-one fight, the game goes from being a normal 2D side-scroller into being a pseudo-fighting game where you're always facing your enemy. It feels pretty good, all things considered. I mean, the hits still don't feel particularly satisfying when they connect, but I do appreciate the fact that Konami went out of their way to at least try and adapt the gameplay to fit the context of being a one-on-one fight. It also explains why the game allows you to block during fights in the first place, something that I'm only bringing up now because it isn't that useful and I genuinely forgot that you could do it. Anyway, I do ultimately like that the game switches the controls like that, even if it does seem like it would be a little weird before experiencing it firsthand. Still though, I'd love to know how the conversation to do something like that went in the first place, since it does sound a little unorthodox. Like, imagine if this was all because it was 1994 and some higher up at Konami saw how popular Street Fighter II was and basically decided to force the team developing the title to just make it play a bit more like that.
Alright, engineer, if you know what's good for you, you're gonna put a useless fighting game mechanic into the side-scrolling platformer you're working on. Why? Because I said so. And then you're gonna help me rob the Pine City stage and replace all its banknotes with pachinko machines because we're Konami and that's what we do. We Konami. I think that's French for rob your friends or something. We're gonna delay the game for a year.
Around halfway through the game, you're thrown into a top-down driving level where you'll need to control the Batmobile in order to chase Two-Face and his goons through Gotham before time runs out. In theory, it should be a fine, if not somewhat underwhelming change of pace for the game, but honestly, it just ends up being boring. It has an alright drift mechanic and it does feature some decent combat, but overall, it's nothing special. Which is a real shame too, because it's punctuated by two of my favorite levels in the game, with the one preceding it being built around chasing Catwoman around Gotham and even fighting her as you two plummet off of a building, and the level that takes place after it revolving around fighting the Scarecrow and some hallucinating civilians you'll need to subdue with some knockout gas or, well... Another minor complaint I have with the game is the fact that it only features Batman as a playable character, despite being delayed by Konami specifically so that they could use Batman the Animated Series' new title of The Adventures of Batman and Robin. And not only is it a shame that you can't play as the Boy Wonder to begin with, the game doesn't even do you the solid of pretending Robin wasn't around at the time of it taking place like they did on the show from time to time, because Robin actually appears in a couple levels as an NPC. Last, I found the game's final level to be a bit lame. Just when Batman's all but saved the day, it's revealed that the Joker had gotten bored of being out of the game since the first level, broke out of Arkham, and has taken everyone else that you've rounded up over the course of your adventure along with him. Which, for the record, makes the Joker and company a bunch of no-good, dirty two-timing sons of... Oh, that's why they're sworn enemies. Because they're shitty people. It's basically just a boss rush with each of the game's major enemies, aside from the roller coaster fight with the Joker, the fight with Poison Ivy, Two-Face, or the VR one with the Riddler, as well as with Clayface and Man-Bat thrown in too for good measure before you square off against the Joker in a brand new fight. And anyone that knows anything about me knows that I just don't enjoy boss rushes. Thankfully though, it isn't that bad in this game, but it still left a fairly bad taste in my mouth and felt anticlimactic. Also, the inclusion of Clayface and Man-Bat makes me wonder whether they were originally going to get stages in this thing or not, but that's also just baseless speculation on my part. Overall though, The Adventures of Batman and Robin is pretty good. I didn't even get to bring it up till now, but the game has some great visuals and music in it, which isn't that surprising on account of this being a Konami game, but still had to be said. It totally nails the look of the show, and it even sounds a lot like it too, due to it having an awesome 16-bit rendition of Danny Elfman's Batman TAS theme in it. If you haven't played this one before, it's definitely worth checking out sometime. I wouldn't call it a must-play Super Nintendo title, but if you're a fan of Batman and you like 16-bit games, you'll probably enjoy it. If you want to get the most out of it, I recommend playing it while you're watching the animated series for some full immersion. Just load this thing up on a Superboy, your handheld emulator of choice, or play it on your TV while you have the show running on a second screen, and have at it. I'd say the Konami's The Adventures of Batman and Robin on the SNES is a solid B-tier game.
Too easy. Piece of cake.
A year before Konami put out The Adventures of Batman and Robin on the SNES, they dropped their first adaptation of the animated series over on the Game Boy, and seeing as the show hadn't changed its name yet at the time, aptly titled it Batman the Animated Series. You know, because Batman, the detective, the vigilante, the superhero, the animated series, the video game was already taken by, well, the Minesweeper game. In it, you take control of old Batsy the Manzy as he jaunts throughout Gotham on an especially purgy night, fighting some of his worst enemies and trying to save the day with the help of his boy ward, Robin. And when I say with the help of, I really mean with the help of, because you actually get to play as him for 2 of the game's levels. Batman controls pretty well in this game, all things considered. I mean, he's a bit on the stiff side, but then again, we are talking about the Game Boy, so I can't really hold it against him. He can jump, duck, throw projectiles at enemies, perform a wall jump, and heck, he can even use his grapple gun to get on top of platforms. On top of that, Robin more or less controls like Batman, albeit without a grappling gun and with the added ability to grab onto ceilings and a nice reference to his days as one of the Flying Graysons. As an added bonus, the combat even feels pretty good in this game. The range of your regular punches can come across as being a bit puny, but aside from that, things have the right amount of heft to make fighting enemies fun and satisfying. And visually, the game doesn't disappoint either. It manages to do a solid job of mimicking the look and feel of the show to the best of its ability given the hardware, and it even manages to throw in some fairly detailed levels with multiple layers and complicated background designs without making it too hard to see where you're going. The game's even the only one of the 5 titles I'm reviewing today that went as far as to remake the opening credits to the TV show. It takes a lot of liberties in doing so because, well, you know, but it's still super cool. Even the music manages to recapture a lot of the style of the show too, maintaining the ominous and eerie orchestral feel of the show and dialing the chiptuniness of it to 11. That, coupled with the Game Boy's monochrome screen, really works for the game, and it makes it feel like the sort of pulp and noir detective stories that inspired the creation of the character. We even get some pretty cutscenes before each of the game's episodes that look especially striking given the stark lighting that's partially due to the Game Boy's limited color palette, which itself recalls the sort of chiaroscuro, an Italian term that means the dramatic contrast between light and dark that was synonymous with film noir back in the 40s. Seriously though, Batman the Animated Series going out of its way to feel as cinematic as it does, for a Game Boy game, was the last thing I was expecting from Konami. I mean, even its 2 Robin levels come with some pretty deft writing for a 2D game designed for a handheld. Instead of having us go through one of the levels as Batman and another as Robin, we have the 2 of them working together until they reach a point where Batman has to continue to chase after Mr. Freeze on his own while Robin goes after the Scarecrow. It doesn't sound like much, but the fact that there's a sense of parallel action in this game, of 2 events happening simultaneously, feels borderline experimental due to how most video games in the same genre wouldn't think of doing something like that in the first place.
I'm taking it to strange new places.
Number 8. Number 8. Number 8. Number 8.
You don't even notice it in the middle of playing the game or anything, but it's still really cool in hindsight. It ain't all perfect though. For starters, the second Robin level has a section where the screen flashes every few seconds due to lightning, and while this was probably fine back in the day while playing it on a DMG-1, it might give you a headache if you're playing it with anything that has a backlight these days. Additionally, while I do think that the level layouts are fine for the most part, the game can still lean towards being a bit too unforgiving due to how scarce lives and extra continues are. Oh, and the game's boss battles. They're fine in and of themselves, but while I was playing this one, I realized how much better that fighting stance approach to the boss fights in the SNES game was. I'd take out my cynical Konami businessman joke from earlier because I guess that could have been a quality of life thing that was added in because of how awkward some of these fights feel, but whatever.
Truth be told, I just wanted to wear the costume again.
But in a nutshell, that's Batman the Animated Series on the Game Boy. I didn't expect it to be as fun of a time as it was, but here we are. When I reviewed every version of RoboCop vs. the Terminator back in October, the Game Boy release of that game turned out to be the worst version of the bunch, and on some level, I guess a tiny part of me was irrationally worried that that would also be the case here.
Trauma! Nifty!
Thankfully though, I was proven wrong because this is a genuinely good game that's worth checking out sometime. Also, while I'm on the subject of my RoboCop vs. the Terminator video, I mentioned that Tim Burton's Batman got an interesting Game Boy game towards the end of it, and if you check the bottom of the shot, you can actually see the Android UI appear in one of the shots in that segment. I don't know why exactly I felt the need to bring that up in this video, but yeah, I thought that was a fun bit of trivia that some of you might find interesting. You can actually hear me noticing it for the first time on the commentary track I did for that video over on my Patreon if you want to hear me die a little inside for not catching it earlier.
Trauma! Nifty!
I had a really good time with this one, and I didn't have many problems with it. As such, I feel like this game gets a high B.
Very good!
But that's enough of that baby Nintendo stuff. Let's move on to what all the big kids are into and talk about the super energetic gaming awesomeness that's the Sega Genesis.
Hey, are you sure people still fall for this kind of marketing? For the millionth time, just shut up and count your money! Hey everybody, it's me, Kevin Conroy. After being violently removed from Konami due to an involuntary manslaughter case that I'm a part of but can't legally discuss just yet, I've decided to bring my talents to the fine folks at Sega! See? It's official!
The Adventures of Batman and Robin on the Sega Genesis was made and published by the folks over at Clockwork Tortoise and came out in August 1995. In it, you take control of either Batman or Robin as you make your way through several levels and, you guessed it, do battle with some of Batman's most dastardly foes who are working alongside Mr. Freeze, who plans to freeze Gotham over in the meantime.
Freezy, I'm feeling hot.
I find that unlikely.
While this game's a 2D side-scroller like the games that preceded it, it's different in the sense that it places a heavy premium on fast-paced action that may not feel entirely austere to the character in the same way that the light puzzle-solving did in the Konami SNES game, but is extremely exciting. On top of that, it's the only game in the bunch that features multiplayer and lets you play through the entire thing as Robin if you want to. Two things that immediately endear this game to me on account of my strong love for co-op capers, my even stronger love for Dick Grayson's Robin in particular, and my having a low enough self-esteem to usually default to playing as him over Batman in any game that I can.
Holy inferiority complex, Batman! How low is my self-esteem that I'm the sidekick in my own fantasy?
It could be worse, Robin. You could be Alfred the Butler.
Damn you, sir.
However, I actually ended up playing as Batman for most of my playthrough of this one because, well, as it turns out, trauma isn't nifty, guys. Therapy is. So that song actually intrusively reminded me of being bullied in middle school. Trauma! Nifty! Anyway, if the SNES and Game Boy Konami games played a tiny bit like Castlevania, where you play as Batman as opposed to fighting a Batman, the Genesis game feels more like Contra Hardcore or Gunstar Heroes. In fact, it almost feels exactly like Gunstar Heroes, down to being able to punch enemies when they're nearby, perform a kick in midair, and grab onto railings and dangle off of them while you're firing at enemies. You can also upgrade your weapons, recover health by grabbing hearts before they fly away, and the game features a handful of side-scrolling shmup levels thrown in for good measure too. To add a bit of depth to things, the game also gives you a meter that automatically fills up whenever you aren't firing at enemies, and when fully charged can be used to deal additional damage to enemies and bosses. There's also a really strong sense of momentum and kineticism in this game. Something somewhere is moving at any given moment, and you genuinely feel like you never have a second to stop and catch your breath without getting flanked by enemies should you do so. In that sense, it kinda reminds me of movies like Crank, Run Lola Run, or Hardcore Henry, since it's constantly pumping you up to take down hordes of enemies that stand between you and a stage's boss, which itself is a prolonged test of your dexterity, patience, and pattern recognition skills. Those boss battles are truly something to behold too, and the best way I could describe them is by saying that they usually start off feeling extremely punishing until you've cracked their pattern, settle into a good groove working within it, and then end up entering a flow or hypnotic state where nothing exists besides you in the game world. It's totally like crack or something.
I love when people say like crack who've obviously never done crack.
Plus, it's got this amazing art style going for it that has this sort of warped or forced perspective thing that gives the adventures of Batman and Robin on Genesis a pseudo 3D look and sense of depth that's really cool. That look, coupled with the game's love for what I like to call bendy graphics, another thing this title has in common with Gunstar Heroes by the way, feels a little reminiscent of the German expressionist and surrealist movements in film from back in the silent era due to how things constantly look perverted from their normal presentation and like they've been heavily reinterpreted or stylized. Whether intentional or not, it's a fitting reference to Batman's very own roots as, while I previously mentioned the influence that stuff like Fleischer's Superman shorts and film noir had on the animated series, it feels like a callback to the sort of brooding and off-kilter art that informed those works in the first place.
It's all connected.
This rings especially true when you recall that some of Batman's greatest rogues were inspired by the works of great expressionist and noir filmmakers, such as the Joker, who was inspired by Conrad Veidt's character Gwynplaine from Paul Lenny's 1928 adaptation of the novel The Man Who Laughs. While graphics have come a long way since 1995, these graphics still pack a mean punch on account of how few games are out there that tried to do stuff that looked like this in the first place. And the soundtrack, oh my god, the game's soundtrack. While it doesn't do so much as try to emulate the style of the series it's based on, there's no denying how infectious and heart-pounding the adventures of Batman and Robin's music is. If anything, it actually reminds me of the sort of music you'd hear in scenes from its sequel series, Batman Beyond, but that could also just be me. Either way though, it's good stuff in the same way that RoboCop vs. the Terminator's Genesis soundtrack was. It's inappropriate to the source material, but it does go way harder than it has any right to at the same time and is a lot of fun. However, I do have one big issue with this game, and it's actually the thing it's best known for. Simply put, the game is hard. Like, really hard. To the point where its difficulty has basically become the centerpiece of nearly every review I could find on the title going back to its release in 1995 hard.
That's enough!
Due to how high octane the action is at any given moment, the amount of projectiles and enemies you'll have to dodge on screen, and the fact that outside of giving you 6 continues, you'll have to get through the game without any saves or anything of that sort, there's a good chance that it'll be a while before you can get to the end of this one or even get past the first couple of levels. And not to dive into that big of a tangent or anything, but I also gotta be honest with you guys and admit that the only way I was able to get through this game for this video was by using level skip codes.
You're a phony! Hey, This guy's a great big phony!
Now, I only used them to get back up to wherever I had been in the game whenever I got a game over and ran out of continues, but I still definitely needed them in order to get through this game in a reasonable amount of time for this video. And for the record, I'm not complaining about the difficulty either, nor am I taking points away from the game because of it. If anything, the game's high difficulty may actually be a selling point and a reason to go check it out these days. I'm only bringing this up for the sake of transparency and because I think it's a great game that a lot of people may enjoy so long as they don't get overwhelmed by its difficulty. Now, some folks online have a thing against using cheat codes, save states, or anything like that to help you get through a game, and while I definitely see where they're coming from and say more power to them for sticking to their guns on this due to getting a sense of accomplishment out of beating a game that was extremely difficult, I'm also here to say that it really isn't that deep. I guess my whole thing with that is that cheat codes, tricks, or exploits have always been around to help people get through games. Stuff like the Konami code, the Infinite Lives trick in Super Mario Bros., which was intentional by the way, or heck, even something like guides and something like Nintendo Power are a thing for a reason. They're there so that players who can't quite figure out how to or lack the necessary time, patience, or skill to beat a game can still have fun and experience everything that the game has to offer them. I mean, without it, there'd probably be a huge chunk of kids that grew up playing stuff like Contra that never actually got to beat it, you know? Plus, it doesn't stop a player from beating the game legit sometime in the future. If anything, it incentivizes them to play more of the game and to become legit. Dare I say, it incentivizes them to be too legit to quit. Even though I did need to use the game's level skip code to get through this in a reasonable amount of time for this video, which by the way is inputting BA down, left up C when the game is paused, I still want to pick this game up again when I have some more time to in the future and try to beat it without using that code or my girlfriend and I getting into a fight over who's holding the team back.
Babe, I'm sorry, Sierra. I'm sorry. I think I'm holding us back. Maybe you should play this alone.
No, I mean, I'm pretty sure I'm the one holding it back.
No, it's me. It's not you. It's me. I think we should still be friends, but I think you should beat this game alone.
Wait, what? You're breaking up with me?
Also, it's just a game, man. I'm pretty strictly against cheating in an online multiplayer environment because it ruins the fun for others, but when it comes to using cheats to goof off or to get to play more of a game that's kicking your ass, go nuts.
You know, we actually make some of our games harder in Western territories in order to compensate for video game rentals and maximize our profits. That's why games like Castlevania 3 and Contra Hard Corps are actually a lot easier when you play the Japanese releases.
Wait, really?
Yeah, the guys at Konami did it all the time.
So yeah, The Adventures of Batman and Robin on the Genesis is a great game, albeit an extremely hard one. It still manages to be extremely fair though, in spite of its difficulty, and it honestly incentivized me to want to play through it without cheats again someday, which is probably the highest honor I could give it. I give this game a high A that's very nearly verging on an S.
Ultimate victory.
Taking things back to the handheld realm though, let's talk about the Game Gear release of The Adventures of Batman and Robin. This version was developed by Novatrade, who are best known for Sega's Echo the Dolphin games, a series that's pretty well known amongst Sega enthusiasts that I actually haven't gotten around to playing yet, though I will have to change that someday soon. Let's get one thing straight though, if I do end up doing that, I'm gonna be playing Echo the Dolphin on the Dolphin emulator using the Virtual Console release for the Wii. Why? Because using the Virtual Console release of a game, an emulated echo of an earlier title if you will, in order to play a game called Echo the Dolphin on an emulator named Dolphin just tickles my brain. Also, I feel like I could do it dressed up like a dolphin too, because why go big if you don't actually go big? Well, that, and I also have to spend this money on something. Hey wait, would that actually be a tax write-off if I did that?
What are taxes?
Anyway, the Game Gear game actually precedes the Genesis one by a few months and is the first title I reviewed today to get an international release, with the Sega CD game I'll be getting to in a few minutes being the only other one to receive such an honor. Much like the Genesis game, The Adventures of Batman and Robin is a side-scrolling action game that places a bit more of an emphasis on platforming than the 16-bit version does, but still features a gameplay loop that's heavier on the action than any of the Nintendo games I've already covered. In spite of this, and some similar enemies that just owe their design to the show itself though, the games couldn't be any more different. For starters, Batman has a straight up double jump in this game that allows you to reach some harder to reach areas and gives me some serious Samus jump vibes from Metroid 2. Additionally, you can also swap out your projectiles for any of Batman's other weapons at any given moment by entering the pause menu as if you're playing a Mega Man game. Not that you'll really be doing it that often though, as your standard Batarang is more than enough to handle anything the game throws at you. Still, I guess it can kinda come in handy during boss battles since it makes fairly quick work of your opponents. One of which, by the way, sorta looks like a jaundiced version of Olive Oyl from old Popeye cartoons. However, outside of those two details, this is fairly standard fare. You can only play as Batman in this game, and even though everything's visualized with nice and colorful sprites, as well as gets punctuated by some fairly decent music, nothing about this really stands out. Although, I could also just be sore about how poorly this game runs. Because yeah, it runs pretty badly. Like, badly enough that I wish I was just the kid in Jackie Chan's Rumble in the Bronx who's playing a Game Gear without any games in it. That's a real thing, by the way.
Penny, this is for you.
For me?
Yes.
Yeah, The Adventures of Batman and Robin's got an extremely choppy frame rate to the point of being, at least in my opinion, borderline unplayable. Like, okay, the game is playable, I guess, but it feels unresponsive and almost irresponsible to pick this game over any of the other titles that I've shown in this video. Aiming as Batman feels imprecise and stiff. That double jump I mentioned felt really hard to pull off due to the timing, and the combat itself felt delayed and more like I was watching Batman fight as opposed to controlling him myself. As if that weren't bad enough, the level designs themselves also felt a bit generic. Like, sure, there are elevators in some levels and impassable walls in others that need to be climbed over in order to imbue the game with a somewhat forced element of exploration, but it just didn't do enough to make things stand out. Frankly, even though I wouldn't call the game that offensive or anything, I just feel like Batman and the people looking to play games about the character just deserves a bit better than this.
Thank you. I really needed this.
Batman's crying.
And not to nitpick or anything, but I also found it a bit weird that the level that takes place in a prison had literal spike pits and spiked doors all over the place because, like, good lord, what kind of prison does that? Do you think the money that went into installing all of those spikes could have been used a bit more constructively, maybe? Like, as a part of a prison rehabilitation program or something? Wouldn't that have had a greater effect on the reincarceration rate in Gotham than throwing barbed wire and spikes onto a rotating car wash brush and calling it a day? There's not really much else I could say about this game. It just didn't click for me. I respect the hell out of it for not trying to just demake the Genesis game, but I can't say that I was particularly pleased with the results either, even if the music and visuals weren't half bad. The Adventures of Batman and Robin on the Game Gear feels like a low C for me.
Barely made it.
Finally, the last game I'll be checking out today is the Sega CD version of The Adventures of Batman and Robin. Like the Genesis one, this was also made by the short-lived developer Clockwork Tortoise, and it came out in the summer of 1995 to mixed to negative reviews. And if you'll want to get real specific, it actually came out in July, a month before the Genesis one hit the market. Which is what makes how unique this game is really weird, if not a little dumb. Okay, maybe not dumb, but it's definitely weird. You see, not only is this a unique game, but it's actually an entirely different game in a different genre. Unlike all of the other Batman games that I've covered today, it's a third-person driving game that takes place entirely from the seats of the Batmobile. You know, of fame. This one has you tasked with racing through Gotham in pseudo 3D, making use of some of the Sega CD's more advanced technical prowess over Sega's stock 16-bit hardware and gunning baddies all over the place in the process. The game's well known for its cutscenes, which featured exclusive and original animation done by one of the animation studios that handled the art on the actual cartoon, and it even features the same voice actors from the show too. And I think it's really cool that this exists too, as if you take note of how long the cutscenes are when played back in order, they're about 18 minutes long, which makes it fairly close to just being the length of an actual episode of Batman the Animated Series. Making things even better, these cutscenes look pretty great on account of how simple and clean the art style of the show was, lending itself pretty well to the Sega CD's video capabilities, which are, well, pretty bad.
No, really.
What I'm trying to get at is that these scenes are really easy on the eyes, and they may be one of the best uses of video on the Sega CD in general, to the point of being a total showstopper between levels. As for the gameplay itself, it ain't too bad, I guess. It's a really fast-paced and exciting romp that, much like the Genesis game, is packed to the brim with action to the point of excess. Seriously, this thing seldom gives you any room to breathe, as you'll always be bobbing and weaving out of traffic, dodging obstacles, or gunning down bosses and enemies. And when you aren't doing any of those things, you'll still have your hands full, as you'll either be trying to pick up as many items as possible or trying to gun it due to a time limit on the top of the screen. Yup, just like Superman 64, another DCAU game, The Adventures of Batman and Robin on Sega CD loves to throw time trials your way, though it does feel more organic here since time trials are a thing in driving games to begin with. Anyway, the action's pretty good, I guess. In conjunction to steering, driving, and raging at pedestrians, you know, car stuff, you can also use a turbo boost, fire mini rockets, and also fire smart bombs so long as you have the ammunition for them. And if you have any intention of getting to the end of this game in order to watch all of its cutscenes, you'll need to make sure you learn how to ration your resources, because while this isn't anywhere near as hard as the Genesis game was, this one's still a bit on the tough side due to some issues that are, in my opinion, tied to the hardware that the game is running on. Because regardless of the fact that this game runs at a fairly consistent frame rate and has pretty decent controls, it also feels like the Sega CD wasn't quite up to snuff for what the game was trying to accomplish. For example, the draw distance is just a bit too on the low side for a game that tries to move as fast as it does, leading to instances where you'll just barely have enough time to dodge oncoming traffic or see items on the road, such as in the Joker's level, which is basically a memorization game due to how much stuff you need to avoid in it. Adding to this is the fact that despite the frame rate being fairly stable, like I said, the actual sprites feel like they're begging to update at a higher rate than they do. In action, it's almost like there's a disconnect between the speed the game wants us to perceive our movements at compared to the animations that should complement them.
There's a disconnect here. Haha, no man, consider it dumb. We'll play it by year. There's a disconnect here.
Maybe I'm just spoiled by the way games are these days, but it makes controlling the Batmobile feel less fun than I think it would have otherwise, especially since so much of its presentation is as good as it is. Despite the fact that the game lacks anything in the way of force feedback, the game sprinkles in all the little details that are needed to make controlling the Batmobile feel dynamic, such as pulling the camera back when you use a turbo boost or making the Batmobile flash when you take a hit. Sure, that stuff is game design 101, so I guess we shouldn't really be singing its praises, but it's still nice to know that it's there. Besides that though, this is pretty cut and dry, with each of the levels putting a spin on your objectives, but still ultimately relying on the same basic gameplay within the Batmobile. Even the game's final level, which is a chase sequence on a bridge that puts you in control of the Batwing to change things up, still kinda just feels like more of the same, albeit with a bit more Y-axis thrown into the mix. With the play length of about an hour or so long if you don't get any game overs, something that's true with all the games I've covered today by the way, it's definitely a shame to see that this game couldn't cook up any extra gameplay styles to mix things up. Variety-wise, this puts it in the same league as the portable versions of the game, which is fine and all since the Game Boy game was pretty awesome and stuff, but definitely feels like a bit of a missed opportunity. It does have a pretty good soundtrack though, with some 90s as hell songs in its repertoire and even a couple of songs that remind me of the 80s, namely Depeche Mode and their song People Are People due to all the metallic sounds. Honestly, I'm just surprised that this game wasn't a repackaged version of the Genesis one that had higher quality music, some cutscenes that could have just been reworked footage from the show, and maybe a few of these driving levels thrown in for good measure. It was pretty ambitious of Clockwork Tortoise to make two fairly ambitious games with unique assets in them and to throw them on the market within 30 days of each other. But at the same time, I can't help but wish we got some composite of those two games here on the Sega CD, as this would have given the game some much needed spice. As for why they went with the driving angle for this game, one can only really hypothesize the reasoning for that decision, but I'd venture to guess that it had something to do with the Sega CD's other Batman game, Batman Returns. That game came out on the Genesis and Sega CD back in 1993 and was developed by Malibu Interactive, the same company that Clockwork Tortoise's staff had previously worked at, and was virtually identical on both platforms with the exception of well-received driving sections on the CD version and higher quality music. Because of this, and the fact that critics at the time were a bit annoyed that the game was just a spruced up version of the Genesis one outside of it, it's a safe bet to assume that they made the games different in order to avoid complaints of double dipping, which is valid, I guess, in the context of the 90s, but sucks in hindsight, especially because the practice of producing enhanced versions of previously released Genesis games was far from being a new practice.
Don't believe me? Well, here's a list I found from an old Sega 16 post going over the games that got that exact treatment.
Other than that though, it's a really fun game. You'd think that I'd probably have more trouble with superscalers like this since I grew up just when 3D games were starting to take off, but I've always enjoyed the games I've played before, and I think this one's worth checking out sometime, even if it's only just to check out the cutscenes. Also, Warner Brothers, what the hell guys? Why haven't you just rescanned the cells for this game and re-released the cutscenes as a bonus feature on a home release yet? Are you guys opposed to making money? I give The Adventures of Bat-Vroom and Rob-Zoom on the Sega CD a B- out of 10.
Not too bad, I guess.
So, do any of Batman the Animated Series or The Adventures of Batman and Robin's games still hold up? Well, yeah, actually most of them do. With the exception of the Sega Game Gear game, this is actually a pretty decent spread of Batman the Animated Series games that you more or less can't go wrong with.
While the real showstoppers for me in this video were the Genesis and Game Boy games, the vast majority of releases based on Batman the Animated Series proved to be a lot of fun. Whether it was the light detective antics of the SNES game, the road rash antics of the Sega CD one, or the platforming action of the Game Boy and adrenaline-inducing frenzy of the Genesis one, there's something out there for everyone looking for a bit of bat action. If I had to recommend any of these games to you though, I'd probably go with the Game Boy one if you're looking for a fun and balanced experience, as well as the Genesis one if you want to be pushed a bit or are looking for something with multiplayer in it. Those two games were truly a cut above the rest, and as an added bonus, also allowed you to play as Robin for at least some of the adventure. As I said at the end of the SNES part of this video though, I can't recommend playing any of these games while watching the show enough. Even though I played through most of these games and watched a decent chunk of Batman TAS before Kevin Conroy died, nothing quite beat hearing his iconic voice in my ears while I played through each of these titles. It was a really cozy experience that, at least for me, felt like it brought my experience with his version of the character to its absolute zenith and helped me get into the headspace of my personal favorite Batman. It goes without saying, though I'll say it anyway, but Kevin Conroy will be missed.
Anyway, that brings us to the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and that if you did, you consider subscribing to the channel, leaving a like, or leaving an answer to the question of the day so that you could help my channel grow. If you'd like, you could also check out my Patreon or buy me a coffee in order to support the channel financially and to get some bonus goodies like commentary tracks, sneak peeks at future videos, and even an unaired Niche Plays pilot from 2020. Anyway, my next upload is gonna be about my first time playing through Chrono Trigger, and it should be out sometime in February, so yeah, be sure to stick around for that if you think you'll enjoy it. So yeah, bye.